Hey everybody, Steve with the TroutWise channel. Today we have what I call the first five. I call these the first five because they're always the first five flies I'll put in my fly box, and they're usually the first flies I take out of my box to tie on the end of my leader when I get to the river. Anytime I'm gathering up my gear for a day on the river, I always check my fly box to make sure I have at least half a dozen of each of these flies. I have yet to fish a river where these flies won't catch fish, and these flies will work winter, spring, summer, or fall. I've fished these in low water, high water, the dirtiest water I've ever seen, in gin clear water, and they always catch fish. Not every one of them will be lights out good every day, but most days, any one of these flies is a good choice. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, they're all nymphs. Yeah, yes, they are. The mission here at TroutWise is to help you catch more fish, and that means being wise to the trout and their behaviors. Most days, nymphing is the best way to consistently put trout in the net, and these flies will help you do just that. Unless I show up to the river and there's some kind of crazy hatch going on with fish just rising all over the place, I'll choose two from these first five to get me started. And we have a nice mix of flies as well, ranging in size from 20 up to 16 and ranging in weight from 6 centigrams up to 45 centigrams. So let's take a look at the first five. First up, we have the Nurple. It's tied on a size 16 jig hook using squirmy worm material, but it is so much better than a squirmy worm. The overall size is only 2 inches and the tail is very short. So it represents a good-sized meal, but it's small enough that it won't spook many trout. Unlike a regular squirmy worm, I almost never have short strikes on the Nurple, and the short tail rarely gets fouled around the hook. It's got a hot spot collar, and the bead is very subtle, not overly shiny or bright. The unique coloration gives it a really natural look. It kind of looks like a worm or a grub or a cranefly larva or something emerging from its larval state. It's one of those flies that doesn't imitate anything, but kind of looks like a lot of things. At 45 centigrams, it's the heaviest fly and the real workhorse of the bunch. This is the one that will get you down lower in the water column where fish normally and frequently spend a lot of their time. It's tied from one single piece of squirmy material that becomes infused with the thread, making it a really tough fly. Next up, we have the blue collar pheasant tail. Talk about an aptly named fly. This thing just works and works and works and rarely gets a day off, at least on the end of my leader. I haven't had a day in over 2 years where multiple fish didn't take this fly. When and if I change this fly, it's usually just for variety rather than because it's not working. The blue collar isn't just so the fly can have a clever name. Blue is the color that trout see best, and blue is the color that remains most visible as water gets deeper. And make sure to choose a darker blue tinsel for this fly. The truer the blue is, the more visible it remains under the water. Clear water, dirty water, fished anywhere in the water column, fish just find this fly. And if you look at the top profile of the fly, you can see that it very much has that mayfly nymph shape. And that might explain why it's so popular with the trout. Being a size 18 and weighing in at 12 centigrams, it's small enough and light enough to fish as a single fly in shallower water. For a heavier setup, I'll fish the Nurple below this blue collar pheasant tail, and it's an absolutely deadly combination. These two flies pair really well. Unless there's an obvious reason to choose another fly, this is absolutely the first fly I tie on my leader. I have more confidence in this fly than any other pattern, period. Number 3 is my OvalZ Midge. I refer to it as zebra midge meets disco ball. This fly uses French tinsel as a ribbing. This is a true tinsel made out of metal, and it has these tiny silver squares, reminiscent of the pieces of mirror on a disco ball. These catch and reflect the light at different and constantly changing angles, just like a disco ball, making the fly seem to sparkle. very different from your typical gold or silver wire. The partridge fibers in the tail become almost translucent and have great movement, and the UV dubbing in the collar adds just a bit of color and bugginess. It weighs 12 centigrams, so it's great as a dropper fished higher in the water column or as a single fly fished in shallower water. And tied on the jig-style hook, it's got a really wide gape, and the upturned hook point gives you a really solid hookup when the trout does take the fly. I've fished it side by side with size 18 and 20 regular zebra midge patterns, and the OvalZ Midge wins every time. It's on the upper limit of the size of fly that I would fish as a midge imitation, but somehow it still works. Maybe because of the size and the tail, it could represent a larger midge or even a smaller mayfly nymph. Don't know, but the fish seem to love it. Number 4 of the first 5 is the sexy Walt's worm. Many of you are probably already familiar with the sexy Walt's. The tinsel and hotspot collar are what make it sexy and what differentiates it from the original Walt's worm. This is another one of those flies that doesn't really represent anything but kind of looks like a lot of things. This particular version uses a slightly oversized bead on a size 18 jig hook, allowing for a shorter, slimmer body that represents the smaller insects that trout feed on all day long. I've always been amazed at how well this fly works. It doesn't look like it should work, but it does. Fish just love it, which is great, but was also the downfall of the fly, because I was constantly replacing the fly because it was just too delicate. After a few fish, it would be so chewed up that it just looked like a little ball of dubbing on a hook with some tinsel and orange thread hanging off the back. So now I tie this a little differently, using a mix of materials that aren't typically used on a sexy Walt's, including Christmas tinsel, twisted fine mono, and my own blended dubbing that I'll link to, or that I've got a video for that I'll link to in the comments. I find that the way that I tie it now, it's much more durable, and I don't have to spend all my free time tying more sexy Walt's worms. Number 5 is another variation on a zebra midge. Why 2 zebra midges? Because trout eat lots and lots of midges. And a beadhead zebra midge is a great imitation of a certain stage in a midge's life cycle where they're most vulnerable and most appealing to the trout. And during this stage, they can be found anywhere in the water column, making these flies very versatile. So the last of the first 5 is my spring midge. Despite the name, this fly is a great choice any time of the year. It's called a spring midge because the lead wraps look like a tiny spring. With this fly, I've inverted the typical zebra midge, making the body of the fly bright and colorful and the ribbing more dull and subdued. Originally, I started tying this as a modern take on the old ceramic flies, and I used the lead wraps because I was trying to see how much weight I could get into a very small midge pattern without it looking unnatural. Turns out that's 6 centigrams, meaning it weighs the same as a number 8 split shot. Tied on an extra short size 18 buzzer style hook with a 1.5 millimeter tungsten bead and the lead wraps, these are pretty heavy for such small flies. And at 6 centigrams, 2 of the spring midges weigh the same as one of our number 2 fly, the blue collar pheasant tail. I'll often fish 2 of the spring midge flies with no additional weight in shallow runs where most anglers might only use 1 fly. It's also perfect as a dropper fly when paired with any of the other first 5. And once again, because it represents a midge pupa, it doesn't look out of place anywhere in the water column. I know some of you are thinking, he said these flies range from size 20 to size 16, so where's the size 20 fly? Well, this size 18 buzzer style hook is extra short, so it's really just barely bigger than many size 20 nymph hooks, and I'll just fish this as a size 20. So there you go. That's the first 5. With the exception of the sexy Walt's worm, I wouldn't expect you to find any of these flies in fly shops, as these flies are the results of my own tinkering and are my own patterns. You can find a variety of the sexy Walt's worms online and in fly shops, and there's a blue-collar pheasant tail available from Eric Kelly over at Fulling Mill, although it's tied a little differently, almost more of a perdigon style. But there is a tying tutorial for each of these flies on the TroutWise channel, and I'll leave links to the playlist for these tutorials in the description. In these tying tutorials, I try and capture as much detail as possible and provide as many details as I can about how to tie these flies, so even a beginning tyer can follow these tutorials and tie these flies. Tie yourself half a dozen of these for your next trip to the river. I'm sure you won't be disappointed. I'd love to hear in the comments if you've tied up any or all of these first 5 flies and how they performed for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.